Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. While I've been getting a number of people asking me if I'm going to take a look at Tasting History with Max Miller's new video on the picnic at the Battle of Bull Run. This is something that if you've studied American history or the Civil War, you might know something about. The first Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as it was known in the South, was fought July 21st, 1861. It's the first major battle of the American Civil War, fought 20, 30 miles outside of Washington, D.C., and it was fought on a Sunday, and all of Washington society, not all, but a lot of Washington society, members of Congress and their families, people like that, came out to watch the battle and have a picnic. I think a lot has been made of that over time, and maybe it gets a little overblown, but it definitely did happen, and it definitely became an issue when the Union Army started retreating, and people had to also retreat back the same direction and kind of clog some of the roads. It's very famously portrayed in TV series like North and South. So we're going to dive into this one today. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary and see all of the fantastic content that Max Miller produces related to food and history. And I want to thank Keegan in Mendon, Utah, out in Mr. Terry's world. Thank you so much, Keegan, for signing up as a patron. Patreon makes a huge difference in my ability to continue making content for you guys, so I appreciate each and every one of you who have supported this channel through membership or through Patreon. Let's dive into this one.
The first battle of the American Civil War took place in July of 1861. Along with soldiers on the battlefield, there were spectators, people who had come to watch the fighting while enjoying a picnic of foods like these sandwiches and pound cake, which I'm making using recipes from the period. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we picnic at the Battle of Bull Run, this time on Tasting History. On July 21st, 1861, the first major battle of the Civil War took place in northern Virginia. In the north, they called it the Battle of Bull Run, named after a river. And in the south, they called it Manassas, which was a nearby town.
And it was pretty typical. It's not exclusively that way in the American Civil War. You have the Battle of Gettysburg, which was called that by both sides, because you didn't really have a major body of water running through there. And then you have battles like Pittsburgh Landing, which is called Shiloh by the north. Shiloh, the North called it based on a little Methodist church that sat in the area where General Sherman defended, whereas Pittsburgh Landing was the name of the place that the Union had set up their camp before the battle. So there are definitely exceptions to that. Vicksburg was Vicksburg for both sides, but a lot of these major battles, Antietam, Bull Run, Stones River, they got named by rivers for the Union and towns for the South.
Even more confusing, a year later there was another battle on that same spot. So there's
and to make it even more confusing than that, at the Battle of Bull Run in 1861, the Union Army was called the Army of Northeastern Virginia, and one of the two Confederate armies was the Army of the Potomac. A year later, the Union Army is the Army of the Potomac, and the Confederate Army is the Army of Northern Virginia. Actually, no, the Army of the Potomac wasn't at the Second Battle of Bull Run. It was the Army of Virginia against the Army of Northern Virginia. Crazy stuff.
Actually a first Battle of Bull Run and a second Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, whichever you want to call it. But as for picnickers, they were only there at that first battle. See, at this time, people thought that it was going to be a very short civil war.
Yeah.
One decisive victory on either side, and it would all be over. Today, we know that it would drag on for 4 long years, but back then, they didn't know that. So
just imagine, I mean, a battle that ended up with hundreds of deaths on each side. If that had been it, instead of the now estimated over 700,000 dead from the war.
Not wanting to miss the action, people from Washington, D.C. came down with picnic baskets to watch the battle. William Howard Russell, a war correspondent for the London Times, wrote that every carriage, gig, wagon, and hack has been engaged by people going out to see the fight. The French cooks and hotel keepers, by some occult process of reasoning, have arrived at the conclusion that they must treble the prices of their wines and of the hampers of provisions which the Washington people are ordering to comfort themselves at their bloody derby. And others recalled that these comforting victuals came in the form of sandwiches and pies and cakes. And so I'm going to make some sandwiches and a cake.
This is actually pretty cool because I've never read any of the accounts of what people actually ate at the picnic for the Battle of Bull Run.
Use a recipe from a northern cookbook for the sandwiches and a southern cookbook for the cakes. We'll start with the cake because it takes longer to make. This recipe is from Mary Randolph's The Virginia Housewife, which was written in 1824 but was still wildly popular in the 1860s. Pound cake. Wash the salt from a pound of butter and rub it till it is soft as cream.
Is that why they call it pound cake? Because it uses a pound of butter and a pound of flour? I never knew that that was the origin for that.
Flour sifted, 1 of powdered sugar, and 12 eggs well beaten. Put alternately into the butter, sugar, flour, and the froth from the eggs, continuing to beat them together till all the ingredients are in and the cake quite light. Add some grated lemon peel, a nutmeg, and a gill of brandy. Butter the pans and bake them.
Amazing.
The flavorings of this pound cake, especially the brandy, are kind of what make it unique and different from today's pound cake, which is usually flavored with vanilla. But the essentials, the 4 main ingredients, remain the same.
Good.
You want a pound of each. So it's best
Some of you have been saying I need to start actually making some of these recipes. And, of course, the issue is that I don't watch these videos ahead of time. So I don't know what he's going to talk about. So I can't really anticipate making the stuff in conjunction with making a reaction video. But I guess I could, like, go later and make it, like, on VTH Extra or something.
To do this recipe with scales. You should always have kitchen scales, but if you want to do it by volume, you can. And so what you'll need for this recipe is 4 sticks or 450 grams softened butter, and you should use salted butter. She says that you need to wash the salt out of the butter, meaning that she was using extremely salted butter, but there would still be some salt left, and that's going to be closest to modern salted butter. Then 3 3/4 cup or 450 grams powdered sugar. And powdered sugar today is actually confectioner's sugar, which usually incorporates some sort of starch in it. So you can make your own powdered sugar, but honestly, it's not going to make any difference in this recipe. Then 1 pound of eggs. And here you really need to weigh the eggs because they can vary wildly.
Yeah.
She was using 12 eggs for a pound, which are pretty small eggs. For me, it was just 8 eggs after taking them out of the shell, and that is how you want to weigh them. Also, I was so happy that the yolks perfectly lined up in a circle.
Yeah.
I thought that was fun.
How'd you work that out?
3 2/3 cup or 450 grams of flour, 1 tablespoon of lemon zest, 2 teaspoons of nutmeg, and a 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters
I'm
of
telling you,
brandy.
this sounds like it's going to be fantastic. I'm really wanting to make this.
And that is quite a bit of brandy for this cake, so it should have a nice booziness, something to warm the cockles. First things first, start by beating the eggs until they are nice and frothy. This is where most of the air that will give the cake its rise will come from, so the frothier the better. Many pound cake recipes today will add a little bit of baking powder, and that will really help to make it nice and airy, more like a modern cake, but at this time, just the eggs. Next up, beat the butter until it is nice and smooth. And you don't want to overbeat it so it's like whipped because it will have trouble holding on to those air bubbles. Just beat it until the butter is nice and smooth. And then add about half of the sugar and beat it in, creaming the butter and sugar together. And once it's smooth, add the remaining sugar and continue to beat. Then do the same with the eggs, about 1/3 at a time, making sure they are completely incorporated before moving on to the next third.
Wow.
Then you can add the brandy and mix until just combined. Then whisk the nutmeg into the flour
I want to taste
along
this so
with the
bad.
lemon zest. If you add these later, they will not be as well dispersed, so it's best to add them to the flour before adding the flour into the batter, which you can now do. Start with about 1/3 of the flour at a time, and you don't want to beat this in, you just want to mix it until it is just combined and there are no streaks left. Then you can bake this in a large loaf pan that you'd use for like making a big loaf of cake, but if you have smaller cake loaf pans, then you'll probably need 2 of them. And you want to make sure to butter them really well and add some flour to help prevent the cake from sticking. Then you can divide the batter between the 2 pans, smoothing the top, and set them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius for 45 to 50 minutes, or until they are browned on top and a toothpick inserted comes out with just a few crumbs. Then remove the cakes from the oven and let them cool in the pans for 10 minutes before turning them out to let them cool completely. And it will take a while for them to cool completely, which gives us time to make our sandwiches, gives you time to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help out the channel.
Yeah, it does.
And we'll still have time to talk
I know a lot of people who don't do YouTube don't really fully know about how all this stuff works. And honestly, those of us who do YouTube don't really know how much of it works either. I'm in group chats with a lot of other YouTubers, and there's so often that we're just like clueless about why one video does well and another one doesn't, or why one channel does well and another one doesn't. And but when you subscribe, when you watch the entire video all the way through, when somebody you're subscribed to has a new video come out and you click on that video to watch it when it gets recommended to you, all of those things are absolutely essential for the success of a YouTube channel. So when people are asking you to do that, it really does matter.
A little bit more about those picnickers at the Battle of Bull Run. The American Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina.
Yeah, commanded by PGT Beauregard, who would be one of the Confederacy's 4-star generals. And it's a really cool place to visit if you ever get the chance to go to Fort Sumter. Depending on the time of year and how much water there is, you can actually walk out to Fort Sumter, even though it's in the middle of the of Charleston Harbor, because it was a man-made fort built on man-made land that actually kind of is attached to the land by a very low piece of water.
But it wasn't exactly off to the races after that. There were no big battles for a while.
There weren't any
Mostly
armies
they were
yet.
using that time to prepare for something bigger, something that they knew was coming. And so a large volunteer Union army was assembled just outside of Washington, D.C., but they had signed up for 3-month contracts, which by the end of July, they were almost up, and so this army could possibly dissolve.
Right, and the reason for that is that at the time, based on the law that was in place, the most that Abraham Lincoln could do as president was call up 75,000 volunteers for 3 months. That was the max under the law, the max time and the max number. So until Congress passed further laws that gave him the power to call up men for longer periods and for a greater number of men, that was all he could do.
So President Abraham Lincoln, worried that his army was going to disappear one day, urged his general Irvin McDowell to march south and seize the new Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. Well, McDowell, knowing that these troops had never seen any real action and had only a few weeks in some cases of training, said, "They are absolutely not ready," to which Lincoln replied, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are green alike."
And listen, I love Abraham Lincoln, but there are so many times throughout the American Civil War where he meddled in stuff he didn't understand. He was not a military genius. He had a little bit of experience as a captain in the Black Hawk Indian War back in the 1830s, but he wasn't a military man. And he was constantly pushing these generals into situations that the generals understood was not advantageous. And McDowell was right about this. They were not ready to march on the South. And not only does he have a green army that has never seen combat, except for some of the officers that had fought in Mexico, but a lot of the Union soldiers are wearing gray uniforms. A lot of the Confederate soldiers are wearing blue uniforms. It was a disaster on the battlefield with friendly fire.
Acknowledging that, yes, the Union Army didn't know what they were doing, but neither did the Confederate Army. And so, on July 16th, McDowell left Washington with an army of 35,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in North America at the time. Large? Yes. Disciplined? Not so much. McDowell wrote that as they were marching into Virginia, they stopped every moment to pick blackberries or get water. They would not keep in the ranks, order as much as you pleased. They were not used to denying themselves much. They were not used to journeys on foot. Now, the Confederate capital was only just over 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., but standing between McDowell and the Confederate capital was the Confederate Army of the Potomac, which was led by Brigadier General Pierre-Gustave Touton Beauregard, a name I always enjoy saying. And that army would soon be reinforced by a smaller army led by Brigadier General Joseph Johnston. So
what you have, if you imagine it this way, think of 4 armies. 2 Union armies, 2 Confederate armies. You have McDowell's army that's marching from D.C. down toward Richmond. That's going to be the one that fights at Bull Run for the Union. There's another force under Robert Patterson that's up kind of shadowing Joe Johnston's Army of the Shenandoah, up around Winchester and kind of that region. and then you have PGT Beauregard's army that's there at Manassas. And so what's going to happen is, and what's going to end up causing the difference in this battle is that Joe Johnston is going to get his army on trains and get them taken to Manassas Junction, and Patterson's going to be left sitting there not realizing that the army he was shadowing has just up and disappeared.
Hoping to fight the Confederates before these reinforcements arrived and before most of his army dissolved because their 3 months enlistment was going to be up, McDowell decided to have the battle there at Bull Run, or the area around Manassas Junction, and word of this impending battle got back to Washington, D.C., and like I said, most people thought that this was only going to be a one-battle war, and so it would be over in a couple days, on to Richmond, and that would be the end of the Confederacy. So people were like, let's go watch it, and let's make it an outing. It's lovely July weather outside. Let's do picnics. So the morning of the battle, carriages and wagons...
See, in hindsight, it seems ridiculous to us, but we're also looking at this through the lens of 4 years of American Civil War. We aren't looking at this through the lens of the time period and what was happening at that time. It made slightly more sense to them than it does to us today.
Poured out of the city on their way to the area around Centerville, about 25 miles outside of Washington, D.C., where they could get a good but safe look at the battle which would be taking place below them. And William Howard Russell, the war correspondent, wrote about all of these people leaving the town just before he did himself. Of course, being a war correspondent, he was going for work and not just to watch a bunch of people die. And so that morning, he wrote in his diary that I swallowed a cup of tea and a morsel of bread, put the remainder of the tea into the bottle, got a flask of light Bordeaux, a bottle of water, a paper of sandwiches, and having replenished my small flask of brandy, stowed them all away in the bottom of the gig. Now, some of the spectators were just civilians who were going to see the battle out of sheer curiosity, but then many of the spectators were there in a slightly more official capacity, mostly congressmen from different northern states.
And you can say they were there in a more official capacity, but they were there for the same reason. They were civilians who were coming out to watch the battle.
There was a private who was in the Union Army who saw a bunch of these congressmen coming through Centerville on their march. We saw carriages and barouches which contained civilians who had driven out from Washington to witness the operations. A Connecticut boy said, "There's our senator," and some of our men recognized Senator Wilson and other members of Congress. Every one of us expected to have our names in the papers when we got home. We thought it wasn't a bad idea to have the great men from Washington come out to see us thrash the Rebs.
I love these eyewitness accounts from people who were there describing this. This really gives you... it's one of the things in the book I'm writing on Company H of the 20th Ohio. It's one of the things I'm relying on the heaviest, which is word for word accounts written down in letters that men wrote back to their hometown newspaper, diaries that they kept of these events. There's nothing that beats the first-hand accounts.
The area that many of the spectators ended up watching from was Centerville Heights, which was a few miles from the battle, safe distance,
Right.
but close enough that they could see the smoke and hear the cannons. And in this area as well was a Union artillery officer named Captain John Tidball, and he had been ordered to hold his guns back from the battle until hostilities began, so he was able to witness the throngs of sightseers coming down from Washington. They came in all manner of ways, some in stylish carriages, others in city hacks, and still others in buggies, on horseback, and even on foot. Apparently everything in the shape of vehicles in and around Washington had been pressed into service for the occasion. It was Sunday, and everybody seemed to have taken a general holiday.
Nobody could get an Uber anywhere.
That is, all the male population, for I saw none of the other sex there, except a few huckster women who had driven out in carts loaded with pies and other edibles. All manner of people were represented in this crowd, from the most grave and noble senators to hotel waiters. But there were also ladies who had come to see the battle. They just seemed to have ended up in a different place from where the captain was. They were actually near to where Russell, the correspondent, was. He said that on the hill beside me there was a crowd of civilians on horseback and in all sorts of vehicles, with a few of the fairer, if not gentler sex. A few officers and some soldiers who had struggled from the regiments in reserve moved about among the spectators and pretended to explain the movements of the troops below, of which they were profoundly ignorant.
Nothing changes. There's nothing new under the sun. You've got some guys out there acting like they know what they're talking about to impress the ladies. Oh, well, you see what's happening here is that General McDowell is going to move his force. You know, you didn't have a clue what was going on, but it sounded really good and it impressed the ladies.
The spectators were all excited, and a lady with an opera glass who was near me was quite beside herself when an unusually heavy discharge roused the current of her blood. "That is splendid, oh my! Is not that first rate? I guess we will be in Richmond tomorrow."
Nope.
The battle had officially begun, though Russell, who at first was a nice safe distance, decided that he wanted to get a better look. After all, he had been a war correspondent for years and had been there on the battlefield in the Crimean War at the siege of Sevastopol and wrote about witnessing the charge of the Light Brigade. Well, it's hard to write detailed accounts of a battle when you're miles away just seeing puffs of smoke over the trees. So, when a Union officer rode up to this group of people and exclaimed, "We have whipped them on all points."
I think that particular image is of General Phil Kearny being mortally wounded right before Second Bull Run. I think it was at the Battle of Chantilly. I'm pretty sure that's what we're seeing there.
He took the opportunity to move closer to the battlefield. And he wasn't the only one, because back in the other area where Captain Tidball was, he said that their view was entirely obscured by trees. And most of the sightseers were evidently disappointed at what they saw, or rather did not see. They no doubt expected to see a battle as represented in pictures, the opposing lines drawn up as on parade with horsemen galloping hither and thither, and probably expecting to see something of the sort by a nearer view of the field, they hurried on in the direction of the sound of battle, leaving their carriages by the roadside or in the fields. Now, most of these men that were going off to see the battle were members of Congress, older men in their 40s, 50s, even 60s, and Tidball says that they're like wearing full suits and hats and really not dressed for the July heat, especially running across fields and into a battle. But he wasn't going to stop them. That wasn't really his thing to do. He stayed where he was until finally someone came and told him that they were winning the battle and that it is time for him to move up his guns.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true early on. So early on, McDowell's plan was a good plan based on what he thought was one army he was facing, not two, was a feint at the bridge over Bull Run Creek while the main part of his army went around the Confederate left and attacked from the north. And they had some early success, and they were driving the Confederates back, and they had taken the field. And then that's when the Army of the Shenandoah shows up. That's when you have the very famous stand of Stonewall Jackson, or at that time, Thomas Jackson, a brigadier general commanding a brigade in that army, who will be named Stonewall that day by General Bernard B., who was mortally wounded.
Unfortunately, the distance between him and the battlefield made it so that information was about an hour old, and a lot can change in an hour. See, as the Confederate Army faltered and was pushed back, reinforcements arrived by rail. And they were led by General Thomas Jackson, who bolstered the line unaffected by the hail of bullets all around him. One Confederate officer pointed to him and shouted, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall," earning him the sobriquet of Stonewall Jackson.
Jackson always said it belonged to the brigade, not to him, and the brigade was called the Stonewall Brigade after that. At the First Battle of Bull Run, Stonewall Jackson's wearing a Union Brigadier General uniform because that's what they had access to. They didn't really have the Confederate uniforms you would see later on. He had been a professor at the Virginia Military Institute, artillery and others, but artillery was kind of his main thing. Not one of the favorites that people had, and early on his men weren't big fans of him either. That changed, of course.
The Confederate Army rallied and quickly turned what looked like a Union victory into a full rout of the Union Army. And a newspaperman from the New York Tribune who was there described the army, saying it was reduced to the condition of a motley, panic-stricken mob. The morale of the army was gone, and the instinct of self-preservation alone animated the flying mass.
And this is where the lack of discipline, the lack of training, the lack of experience come in. They're just running. And there's nothing in the world that the officers are going to do to control them in that situation.
Eventually, this news also reached Captain Tidball, who was told to now turn his artillery around and get off the roads to make room for the Union retreat. But it wasn't just him that was clogging up the roads. It was also all of those carriages and wagons that the spectators had left when they went to get a closer look at the battle.
And if you watch the TV series The Blue and the Gray, they do a fantastic job of portraying this retreat that happens. I mean, they show it in North and South as well, but I think the Blue and the Gray version of showing all the roads being clogged by the carriages and things like that really well.
Spectators who were now fleeing from the battlefield just as the soldiers were. Tidball wrote that he saw them in the distance emerging from the trees, running toward him. And one of those people was Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, who was lagging behind some of his fellow congressmen. Tidball wrote that next came Wilson, hot and red in the face from exertion. When young, he had been of athletic shape, but was now rather stout for uphill running. When he reached my battery, he halted for a moment, looked back, and mopping the perspiration from his face, exclaimed, "Cowards! Why don't they turn and beat back the scoundrels?" Ironically, he says this while he's running for his own life, and while he's leaving his friend, Senator Benjamin Wade from Ohio in the dust. Wade was over 60 at the time, and probably also
Wade spent time as the president pro tem of the Senate, and at one time, after the vice president was next in line to the presidency,
have been running up hills at a battlefield. And it actually was not his friends who waited for him, but it was Captain Tidball who waited for him to come up the hill, and then before letting him move on, he sat him down, gave him some whiskey, and then said, "Okay, finish your retreat." Each of the picnickers, as they got back to where the carriages had been left, took the first one at hand, or the last if he had his wits about him enough to make a choice. Thus, jumping into the carriages, off they drove, so fast as lash and oaths could make their horses go. Carriages collided, tearing away wheels or stuck fast upon saplings by the roadside. Then the horses were cut loose and used for saddle purposes, but without the saddles. These fleeing picnickers were the lucky ones because there were some who did not so easily escape. Like Congressman Alfred Ely of New York, who found himself surrounded by Confederate forces and was captured and sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. That was one of the prisons that I talked about in last year's video on Civil War prison food.
Oh, we're going to have to do that one.
It was not a great prison to be at. And Libby was there for 6 months before finally being part of a prisoner exchange. And while he was there, he wrote in his diary, among other things, I found that to...
And Libby Prison was, at least initially, it was a prison for officers, not for enlisted men, though I think later in the war, there were so many prisoners that they were just throwing them wherever.
Visit battlefields as a mere pastime, or with the view of gratifying a panting curiosity, or for the sake of listening to the roar of shotted artillery and the shrill music of flying shells, which motives, however, were not exactly mine, is neither a safe thing in itself, nor a justifiable use of the passion which Americans are said to possess for public spectacle. The Union Army ended up suffering nearly 2,900 casualties, including 460 killed, and the Confederates suffered just under 2,000 casualties, with 387 killed. The battle was much bloodier than most anyone thought that it would be at the time.
And when you think about those numbers in terms of the later battles of the Civil War, those are nothing. But at the time, that was a massive casualty count. You didn't see anything like that. I mean, you have battles in the American Civil War where there are more killed than were killed on all the battlefields of the Revolution.
But it pales in comparison with the later battles where you have tens of thousands of casualties. The reason that the battle was important, rather, was that, one, it showed people that this was not going to be a quick victory for either side. But it also spurred the North into action. President Lincoln called for 1 million volunteers to sign up for 3-year enlistments rather than the 3 months after the attack on Fort Sumter, and the people heeded the call, swamping recruitment offices over the next few weeks. Though personally, the most interesting thing about the Battle of Bull Run for me has to do with a civilian, a grocer named Wilmer McLean. McLean had a home near Manassas, and he allowed General Beauregard, the Confederate general, to stay there and make it his headquarters in the days before and during the battle. And actually, a couple days before the battle, there was an artillery skirmish, and a cannonball came busting through the fireplace and into the kitchen while the general was there.
And there was at least one civilian killed during the battle. Mrs. Mrs. Henry, the widow Henry, who Henry House Hill, as they call it, which is where Stonewall Jackson got his name, standing on, making his stand on Henry House Hill. The widow Henry was killed during the battle.
Well then, a year later, there was a second battle at Bull Run, and it also was like on his front yard.
He's like, I'm out.
Where this battle took place, and so McLean was like, yeah, I'm out of here. I'm moving 120 miles south to Appomattox. Well,
which, if you look at a map, makes sense. It's south, but then it's also significantly west of Richmond. It's not in that corridor between D.C. and Richmond where almost all of the battles are going to be fought by the major armies throughout the Civil War in the East. But fate has a funny way of making things happen.
Fast forward to April 1865, and General Lee is there making his last stand at Appomattox against the Union Army, which he loses. And so he needed to find a place to surrender his army.
Interesting. Meade was not there. I think Meade was out with his army. Sheridan probably was there, but Meade definitely wasn't there.
To the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and he asked McLean if he could use his parlor, which he did. And years later, McLean was said to have remarked that the war began in my front yard and ended in my parlor. And now, let us make our sandwiches. So sandwiches in the mid-19th century were really, really basic. It was just usually bread with some butter and a piece of meat, and that was it.
Sounds good to me.
It was chicken or ham or tongue. A lot of tongue sandwiches at the time, but I did find a recipe from a northern cookbook from 1857 that is specifically for sandwiches for traveling, which is perfect for a picnic. And it says,
put them in a Ziploc bag.
Sandwiches for traveling may be made of the lean of cold beef, roast or boiled, cut very thin, seasoned with French mustard, and laid between two slices of
But you gotta ruin it with mustard
So
for.
all you do is spread some butter on some white bread. That would have been the common sandwich bread at the time. Then add some sliced roast beef, then spread a little Dijon mustard on top. What this recipe doesn't include that most recipes from the time do is that the crusts of the bread should be cut off. And here we are. A picnic lunch ready to enjoy at the Battle of Bull Run. So let us start with the sandwich. It's just roast beef, a little butter, a little mustard, nothing crazy.
Sounds good, minus the mustard.
Basic? I usually don't put butter on my sandwich bread. That's actually really nice. Butter just makes everything better. But honestly, it's just a basic sandwich. Not a lot you can do. A little bit later on in history, sandwiches get really interesting.
I like them simple.
You ever watch Sandwiches of History?
I'm pretty much a sandwich and meat, or bread and meat guy for my sandwiches, and that's it. And same thing with burgers.
Another channel.
Ketchup.
He does lots of really cool sandwiches, but they're usually from a little later on in history. What should be more interesting is the pound cake.
Oh, it's gonna be so good.
Most pound cakes today, like I said, they either add some leavener, chemical leavener, or they cheat and they alter the amount of butter. You know, it should be 1 pound of each, but they'll cheat and make it so there's a little bit more egg or something that gives it a little bit more rise. This is definitely denser than most pound cakes today, but not horribly. It doesn't look stodgy, but it got actually a good rise on top. Let's give it a try. Super flavorful.
Yeah, I bet.
That nutmeg is lovely. The brandy, you can really taste the brandy.
Nice.
In a pleasant way. It's not boozy, it's just the flavor of the brandy.
So that tells me that the kind of brandy you use definitely matters.
That's actually a lot better than most pound cakes today, I think. The flavor is much more complex. The texture, I mean, it could be a little bit lighter. It is dense, but not unpleasantly so. Like I said, it's not stodgy, it's just dense, but the flavor is really, really good. This one's worth making. The sandwich, I mean, it's a sandwich. So make this picnic lunch and eat it, but not at a battle. Don't go picnicking on a battlefield. That's just, it's not something to do, especially because, like the Congressman Alfred Ely, you might end up in a Confederate prison.
All right, as always, he does a fantastic job with those. I really enjoyed it. So definitely check out Max Miller on Tasting History if you haven't already seen his channel, if you found that at all interesting as I did. So I want to thank Tracy North and Bryce Houston. I don't have addresses for either one of you. That's why I gave your last names. Thank you so much for your long-term support on Patreon. Been signed up since back in October. I really appreciate it. If you want to learn more about how to support the channel on Patreon, check out the link in the description below. Thanks for watching.